I will start now. We are recording.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining
You're
us.
welcome. Okay.
We really appreciate the opportunity.
I keep your applause down, everybody.
So I guess we could just jump into the questions then.
Well, you introduced me, weren't you?
Oh yeah,
Introduce.
sorry. Danny Fingeroth, great comic book writer, longtime editor, and writer of one of the best Stan Lee biographies that I just ordered recently, and I hope to have in time for the holidays. And overall, it's a
Well,
great honor to be speaking to you.
book is called A Marvel. I just happen to have it here. It's A Marvelous Life: The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. It's the first biography of Stan to come out after his death. Um, and yeah, it's been well reviewed. It was a book of the year for the Times of London, the Sci-Fi Channel. Um, and well, we can talk about Stan if you want, but
Oh, we got some questions about it, but
if you make it through, if you many viewers out in Zoomland make it through, I did the audio book, and I also did the audio book of two of my earlier books, Disguised as Clark Kent and Jews, Comics Integration, the Superhero, and Superman on the Couch. What superheroes really tell us about ourselves and our society. So if you're an audiobook person, those are available, and they disabused me of the notion that I didn't have a New York accent because people will compliment me and say, "Oh, I really love that audiobook, especially your authentic New York accent." So apparently, I have one. Anyway, let's.
and I'm gonna attach all the links for your work when I send out the recording.
Okay.
So the first question we've got, you've written some books about the importance of superheroes and their creators. What inspired you to write them?
Let me ask you. I will answer that, but my question is this: your club, is it specifically a superhero club, or is it a comics and graphic novels club? What's the club?
It right now it's just comic books. We're trying to encompass everything. Not I've read a lot of comic books that aren't about superheroes. I know, like, even though they're the mainstream, there's a lot of other genres.
Have you read? Are you familiar with Mouse and stuff like that? You know,
Oh yeah, I had to read Mouse for a class last semester.
all right. So you
It
got
was
some.
I enjoyed it.
So the question, what inspired me to write the books? Was that the question?
Yeah, what inspired you to write them?
Well, I spent, I started reading comics when I was about 5 years old, and then I was prime target age for Marvel when it first happened. With starting with the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and Iron Man and all the characters that people know. And oh wait, let me. Oh, now it's beautiful. Okay. And I just felt that I had a lot of insight into what makes these characters tick and why people like them. And then my book about Jews and superheroes, specifically about the contribution of Jewish creators and publishers to the genre and to the medium. Um, yeah, I felt like I had, as an insider, having worked at Marvel for close to 20 years as a writer and editor, I felt like maybe I could bring something to the table that other critics or historians couldn't, just because I've been an insider.
I think that's an awesome answer. I love the Jewish contribution to the comic medium. I think it can't be overstated enough. Your book is definitely on my list next after the Stan Lee biography.
Yeah,
Um,
it's it, it's out of print, but you can find used copies. And again, the if you're an audiobook person, it's an audiobook. I'd like to get it back in print. The rights to Superman on the Couch and Disguised as Clark Kent have reverted to me, and uh, I think there's an audience for them.
oh yeah, there definitely is. That is awesome. Um, with the with the explosion in recent years of comic book movies, how do you think that's affected the lives and perception of the creators of comic books?
Huh. You know, for better or worse, I think there's always this tug of war in creative fields in general, but especially in something that's an ongoing saga like comic books, right? It's what's what is the company trying to sell? And there's not any one answer, but are they trying to sell the characters and their history, or are they trying to sell the reputations of the creators? Um, and it's always to the advantage of the owners, the companies that own the characters, to have the characters uh, be the dominant thing they're selling, as if actual human, as if the characters just appeared magically, as if actual humans did not create them. Um, and it's a trade off, So I'd say there are a few creators whose names people know. I mean, I think it's I guess Stan Lee being one of them, maybe Frank Miller, maybe Bill Sienkiewicz, maybe Neil Adams. I don't even know. I mean, that maybe Brian Bendis. But for the most part, the characters are much better known, and that's the quote unquote brand. Read me the question again because I know I was answering it, but then I got off track.
All good. With the explosion in recent years of comic book
Right,
movies, how do you think that's affected the
right,
perceptions of comic book creators?
right. So so some creators have definitely become celebrity. Todd McFarlane, I guess, would be a major one. I'm sure there's people who, Art Spiegelman, in a non-superhero genre. Um, so I would say for certain people who are very good at being public figures and very good at using media, um, it's affected them well. I think, and I guess there's maybe a growth in comic book conventions. So people who maybe had created comics years ago can sell autographs and sketches and do panels and so on. But I think, with the exception of maybe a dozen or fewer, famous comic creators, I don't. You know, I think it's still when you, with the except, well, even the Big Bang Theory, which I was not a big fan of, I have to admit, but even that show, the subtext of that show is that people who like comics are adorable but weird, and they're still somehow, freakish and don't fit into normal society. I think there's still that perception. It definitely used to be, say, 20, 30 years ago. If you wanted to show in a movie that somebody was an idiot, you'd have them reading a comic book. I think we may have evolved to the point where now, if you want to show that somebody's a twisted genius, you show them reading a comic book. Um, but yeah, so I mean, can you now go? You know, so I don't think, for the most part, as I say, except for a few people who've made themselves celebrities or who've become consultants to Hollywood studios, I think the average comic creator is hustling and struggling, like artists always do.
No, yeah, I like what's called. I was at a few conventions, and I always noticed that like the comic creators who have the longest lines are only the ones with movie adaptations in the works. Even if they're great creators who've been in the industry for decades, their lines are like completely empty unless they have a movie or something.
Well, the movie, or I mean, I'd say, I mean, it's true. I mean, the X-Men have a movie, but I think Chris Claremont is perennially popular. I think
Oh yeah, he's amazing.
so I mean, I think with those guys, they've they're still not celebrities that, if you stop the average person on the street and said, who Chris Claremont is, I still think the average person would have no idea. Um, but right, when you're in the context of a comic book convention, then yeah, then there are people who do have staying power like that, and who are, who are. I mean, look, Stan was the ultimate example, right? I mean, you know, he very cleverly, and also because he was a ham and he liked to act, so he got himself. I think there's a lot of people who recognize Stan from the movies or TV shows, but they couldn't really tell you exactly what he did or why he, some. I think a lot of people would say, "Oh, he owned Marvel," which he never did. Uh, he invented Marvel, which really he kind of, he co-created the characters, but he didn't start the company. I mean, he jump started and improved and expanded the company, but those are all kind of abstract concepts to some, to just a typical uh, fan. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but he he was uniquely positioned to become famous for reasons that most people don't really understand. You know?
Awesome answer. Um, what's your favorite title that you've worked on?
Ah, that's always I think I think it would have to be Spider-Man, which oddly enough was not my favorite as a kid. I mean, I missed Amazing Fantasy 15, but I did buy Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man #1 off the stands. Yes, I'm that old. Um, and I liked Spider-Man well enough. I bought every issue, but there were sort of personal connections I felt more to other characters, and the Fantastic Four was always, the Lee Kirby Fantastic Four material is probably the greatest superhero comics ever done. Other people, I'm sure, would have different opinions. That might be a generational thing, but so again, I've forgotten the exact question. The question is,
What's your favorite title you've worked
favorite.
on?
Yeah, I mean that's like asking someone to choose their favorite child or something. But I would say Spider-Man, just because he lends himself to such a wide range of types of stories, and he was not the first superhero, obviously, but that his slogan, "With great power, there must also come great responsibility," really is ultimately it's really the slogan of every superhero, and and what it is a metaphor for growing up. I mean, that's why it's um, so powerful and hooks people so much. So yeah, I would say that's super. Even more than Superman, although obviously he's Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. I mean, these are all very elemental characters who dress in primary colors, and every kid can, even a 4-year-old can draw a picture of Spider-Man or Batman in some degree. Yeah, I think just because of my personal involvement, both editing and writing and reading as a fan, Spider-Man. But a different day I might have a different answer.
Yeah, every day I just switch my favorite comics and movies and stuff like that. I get that. Um, how did you get started in the industry?
Um, I did it the traditional way. I knew somebody. Um, I didn't. I mean, that's a flip answer, but I'll tell you why I give that answer, and I'll expand on it. But I will digress really early in this answer. I put out a magazine through Two Morrows Publishing, TWO Morrows, because it's two people named Morrow who run the company and own the company. If you guys are comics fans, you probably know Alter Ego magazine and Back Issue um, and Draw.
Oh, yeah.
They're a great publisher. They put out a lot of terrific magazines and books. I did a magazine called Right Now, WRTENOW, which was about writing for comics and animation. Um, and I would obviously interview writers about their careers, like you're doing now. And I would say that same question: how did you get started? and they'd say something like, well, I was having lunch with John Byrne one day, and I go, "How did you get to have lunch with John Byrne?" I mean, you know, and it would, and people tend to take it for granted, and so I tried to peel back the layers of the onion and get them to kind of walk it back because, so, what is it that takes you from being looking in the window to being inside the building? And but somehow it's sort of the story that the automatic story that a lot of us tell after you get interviewed a lot sort of just became like they skip a bunch of these steps, and I would really, in my annoying but charming manner, I would have to, you know, draw them back. Well, what were the other steps that got you to having lunch with John Byrne or whatever, um, and so like many things in life, comics, it's always better, and it's almost always better to know somebody than to try to get into something cold. But I mean, I knew somebody who could get me in the door for an informational tour at Marvel Comics. I graduated college. I had a degree in film. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I grew up in Manhattan, so I can't, like every college kid who doesn't know what they want to do, you go home. But for me, home happened to be Manhattan. I knew somebody who could get me in the door for an informational tour. While I was there, I ran into somebody that I went to high school with, and through him, I ended up getting an entry level job in what was called the British department, which was a department that there was a black and white weekly comics market in Britain, like 2000 AD, if you've ever seen that.
Oh yeah.
So Marvel at that point was trying to get into that market by some new material featuring Captain Britain mostly, um, and because what you want is a comic called Captain Britain that's written and drawn by guys in the Bronx and Brooklyn, which we had, and Queens. We went through all the boroughs, but I mean, so it was a entry level job. A lot of it was reprints, and I hadn't read comics for a number of years. Excuse me, I kind of given up superhero comics, in the somewhere in the early '70s, if you can imagine such a thing. And But I was very interested in movies and underground comics and just art and storytelling. Um, and so I was working for Stan Lee's brother, a guy named Larry Lieber, who was the co-creator, as you may know, of Iron Man, Thor, Groot. He's still around. He's 91 years old. He's writing, he's still very active. He just until just a few years ago, he was drawing the Spider-Man newspaper strip.
Oh
Anyway,
wow.
Larry was my first boss and trained me, and so that was um, a lot of it was kind of maintaining schedules and taking like 22 and 17 page comics and splitting them up into chapters and getting new covers and splash pages drawn. So that was how I started. Um, but I didn't come into it cold. I had loved comics as a I always loved comics, but I'd loved specifically Marvel comics as a kid and a teenager, and so I felt, yeah, it was obviously a good fit. Not that our joke used to be it beats having a real job. Well, it was having a real job. There was all stress and deadlines and personalities and all sorts of stuff, but it definitely, um, overall, I think beat having a real job.
That's interesting. I didn't know you had a film degree. Like when I came to college initially, I wanted to go to film school, and then I realized I wanted to like work in comics, and that's what like I'm trying to shift my trajectory to. So that's interesting. I hear a lot of people like one of like my mentor, my college paired me through. He majored in film, and he ended up going into comics too. Like I didn't realize how popular that was.
Yeah.
His name is Scott Nicholas Amendelor. He works for a small publisher.
Uh-huh. Well, there's I mean, it's an interesting field because it's creative, but it's also commercial, but it's words and pictures put together to tell a story. And if you know your Harvey Pekar, do you know who Harvey Pekar is?
Didn't he
American
do the American Splendor?
American Splendor, yeah. As Harvey Pekar said, It's words and pictures, and there's anything, you can tell any story with words and pictures. But I mean, it's, while it's a truism that's not true, that, comics are movies on paper. They're not. They're comics. But there is a lot of similarity between them in the sense that you're looking at a frame of some size with, in comics, the movie is in your head, right? I mean, if you just like take a sideways glance, even the greatest comic is just a bunch of static images, but in your mind, that's, it's very interesting because not everybody can read comics. I know some very smart people who just neurologically are not wired, and they look at a comic and they don't know. Do I read the words or the pictures? What do I do? You know, there are some very intelligent people who don't make that movie in their head. You know, but there is, uh, yeah, you know, it makes sense that there would be crossover between those mediums or media.
Yeah. Um, what was your favorite creative team you worked with?
Oh, it's I, that I refuse to answer that question on the ground that people might stop talking to me. Um, it's there are well, look, I loved working with JM and with him and Sal. I mean, I'll just name some people I loved working with. I'm not going to say, Mark Bagley, Tom DeFalco, Howard Mackey, Sal Buscema. I'm sure, Fabian Nicieza. Um, these, you know, they're people who liked collaborating. You know, there are some people who don't, and who are incapable of compromise or hate compromise, or hate even discussing the possibility of compromise, which is kind of weird in a field that's as collaborative as comics. Um, so I always enjoyed working with people who could take criticism or comment and not feel like it threatened their very being. That they could just go, I agree with that, or I don't agree with that, or and have a discussion, um, and not act as if you had just I don't know, broken into their house and assaulted their family.
So
So
setting aside ego, you would say, is like one of the most important things.
look, I mean, there's egotistical people who've created great comics, but uh, a lot of it is chemistry. There are people who think I'm the best editor they ever worked with, and people who think I'm the worst editor they ever worked with. I'm the same guy. Clearly, there's something about the chemistry in those relationships. I think. I think what's hard. Um, Sometimes you see. I assume because this is a comic club, you read credits, and so you see different credits, and say a title will shift from, maybe from one editor to another editor. And I guess to most readers, it's just, well, big deal. It's just somebody else signing the vouchers. But there's often a lot more to it than that. And when when a person or a team is used to working with a certain editor a certain way, it almost doesn't matter who the next editor is. It just won't. I mean, it's obviously something that does work, but sometimes it's very difficult because it's a different chemistry. So I mean, it's I think it really ultimately, not to get too psychological on me, although I did write a book called Superman on the Couch. Um, I think a lot of it just has to do with one's own family dynamics and what was considered acceptable behavior in the house you grew up in, and then it sort of translate, right? That's the whole thing with school and with work. Your family raises you, or somebody raises you. Robots raise you, whatever. Somebody raises you, and you so have these set of expectations, and you know what you expect of other people, what they expect of you, what constitutes love and what constitutes disrespect, all this stuff. And you've learned all this stuff, in some way or shape in your family. And you go out into the world with people who've had all sorts of other different lessons they've learned, and you have to cooperate with them. So if you're lucky, you find people who have sensibilities, and that you can work together and not, and enjoy. But yeah, but it certainly is. I always found it mystifying to this day that someone would enter into a collaborative relationship but not be able to collaborate. But what are you
That's
gonna do?
interesting. I didn't expect many people would like enter that. Like I know comics, like there's so many different roles involved. I never would have guessed that like there would be a big number of people who don't want to collaborate. But that's interesting.
Well, maybe they just don't want to collaborate with me. I mean, there may be somebody else. There may be somebody else they respond to much better.
That's
Um,
interesting.
but they're, yeah, it is interesting. And I think it's true in all creative fields. And there's this, I'm not saying people shouldn't stand up for their work, and they shouldn't have pride in it, and they shouldn't, advocate for their ideas. Um, but if you absolutely can't compromise, write a novel. I mean, that's you know, then you don't have to worry about, or write and draw your own comic and self-publish it. But if you're playing in a ball field that, for better or worse, is a company, a corporately owned uh, property, to use a very loaded word, but a corporately owned character, um, then at a certain point, um, yeah, it just makes life much more pleasant for everybody. But whatever. I don't even remember what the question was, but
It's a good segue into the next one though. Like, what were your responsibilities as an editor, and like, what was it like working for Marvel Editorial? Like, what kind of like instructions were you given? What kind of restrictions?
that's interesting. You know, superheroes are they're either a genre of their own, or they're a hybrid of a half a dozen other genres. So our job was to somebody, I didn't make up this phrase, maybe it was DeFalco or Sugar, to give people what they expect, but not in the way they expect it. I
That's
think
interesting.
in other words, what I used to say, and I still, I seem to still be alive, so what I still say is, our job was to make readers so angry that they had to buy the next issue to see how he was screwing up. Because, and again, it's slightly facetious, but I mean, if readers have a finite amount of money to spend on entertainment, whether it's comics or movies or records, music, um, and they think they can skip an issue of Spider-Man because, oh, it's just another Spider-Man fighting the bum of the month, and May goes to the hospital or whatever. If they think it's just going to be that month after month after month, a lot of people will just say, well, I'll skip that and I'll buy this issue of Batman because there's some incredible storyline. Um, but the storylines that get people excited are ones that give them something they're not expecting, something they think they don't like, something they think is the last thing you would do with a character. But then you have an obligation to tell as good a story as possible. At the end of the day, Spider-Man is about great power. With great power, there must also come great responsibility. That doing the right thing is the right thing. That strength of character, even a flawed character, will triumph over malevolent intentions, no matter how outnumbered. So you have an obligation in a genre, in an action adventure slash superhero genre, to provide that. So I think that's probably the most important thing I learned. Um, and ideally, I'm not sure if this is so true anymore, but there's both a conscious and an unconscious mentoring system. I mean, when I came into the business, Marvel, I mean, comics have been around for 40 years, but you know, but say Stan Lee was still writing, Jack Kirby was still drawing. You know that a lot of people whose names Steve Ditko was. I mean, Steve Ditko was drawing till he died a few years ago. 2 years ago, I think. There's maybe more. When did he die? With this pandemic, time is really mixed up. But
Yeah.
3 or 4
Yeah, I
years.
think it was recent.
Yeah, well, 3 or 4 years ago, but not anyway. So
Oh
there
wow,
are
4 years ago. Yeah. Wow.
yeah there are people. Yeah, the pandemic has thrown everybody's sense of time off. The um so there's both a conscious and an unconscious amount of mentoring and education that goes on. Um, yeah, so I mean that's how I plus all of us, everybody in modern technological society has read or seen or heard thousands of stories by the time you're in your 20s. So um, yeah, there was a consciousness, um, both by Jim Shooter and Tom DeFalco, who were the two editors in chief, that I mainly worked under. I worked you know, I guess Archie Goodwin was was the chief when I came in, but I wasn't. I was working in a different department. But so Larry Lieber. But yeah, there's a awareness that I don't want to call it a formula because that makes it sound like a formula, but there's definitely a recipe. There's a structure that a action adventure superhero story has. And if you're working at a Marvel Comics, well, there's this decades backlog of a legacy of story and character development. And how do you pick and choose from that? And, how do you find a nugget of a story to extract and expand, but don't become strangled by the continuity and beholden to a story that took place before your reader's parents were born, you know? Um, but so I think that, I mean, fundamentally it's story, and then how do you apply it is Marvel and DC, are unique. Maybe James Bond is similar in that they are these entertainment franchises that have been going on longer than a lot of people's lifetimes. And even James Bond, every 10 years is a new James Bond because actors get old, they age out. But with comics, you won't, it's like, it's kind of like The Simpsons, but as time goes on, it's really a unique high. There used to be tons and tons of periodicals that had fiction in them, but I don't. I think the Marvel DC, or I'm sure somebody out there will know something that I'm forgetting. But the idea that there's this complex, interconnected universe that's been going on uh, for 80 years is really unique. And so how you approach that and deal with it is always a challenge. And I think the longer and then of course, let's face it, comics comics have come back, but the most popular comics are manga and the Scholastic stuff, right? The Raina Telgemeier, and Dove Pilkey and that that stuff, the and the Wimpy Kid, that stuff sells in the millions and millions. I mean, that stuff so outsells superhero comic books. So comics are healthy. The medium is healthy, but superhero comics are a niche market, and most people know the characters from the movies and TV shows and video games. So how do you make comic books? How do you balance that? How do you balance this 80 years of continuity of Spider-Man with the fact that most people have never read those comics? You know?
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, manga seems to be a lot more mainstream, and like, despite all the major superhero movies, because manga is just so easy to like jump into, because there's only like one book you need to follow. And like, I'm surprised. Like at the end of like comic book movies, there's like not an ad for comics. Like, hey, if you like this character, you should read about them. Like, they seem to be very detached, and I'm surprised it's like not. It hasn't become much bigger.
This is one of those questions that people have been asking at least since, well, I guess the old Superman TV show from the 50s did say, did mention the character from Action Comics and Superman. But yeah, then the modern era, I don't have an answer to that. It seems like a no-brainer, or you know, or why not put racks of comics in the lobby at a movie theater? I think I'm sure it's been tried, and I think the answer is that just because somebody likes, dare I say, a particular intellectual property, doesn't mean they have an affinity for the medium of comics. Again, there are some exceptions. I think there have been some tie-ins that have sold pretty well. I forget the exact. You could look it up, but I mean I forget. But let's say let's say you sell 1 million copies of a comic book. So maybe if 3 people read that comic, which is unlikely because most comic book people like put them in bag, or not most, a lot of people put them in bags and board. But let's say with what used to be called a pass along audience, let's say 3 million people. Well, if you have a tentpole superhero movie and only 3 million people went to see it, that would be considered the world's biggest failure. Right? Um, so I think I guess the stakes are so different. I mean, look, certainly, um, there are people who make a lot of money in comics, and especially like in the '90s boom era. Marvel and DC instituted a program where they give a teeny tiny royalty um, based on the cover price to the writers and artists. And some people did become millionaires that way. So it certainly is and a lot of people didn't become millionaires, but did very well. But when you have an ecology where a comic is considered selling a lot, if it sells 10,000 copies, people aren't making that kind of money. But so I think just in terms of a corporate bottom line, I think they see comics as a idea factory, as a place to generate ideas um, and then a research and development arm. But yeah, one would think that it would cost nothing to Disney or whoever owns DC these days to put like a 10-second ad at the end going, if you like this in between. But yeah, they don't seem to do that.
I forgot who I heard it from, but they said that like Marvel editorial, like they have not a mandate, but like it's they're told to write stuff that can be adapted into movies in like the next 10 years. I don't know how true that is, but like it feels very plausible now.
Um, Look, I haven't actually, I've done some stuff for them recently, and I do, I'm a consultant on that Marvel traveling exhibition, and Mike Manley and I did a Darkhawk comic last year. I think it was last year. Um, so I don't know what the man, but I mean, it makes total sense because even though I don't think the companies pay a hell of a lot, but if you do, you know, my understanding, and don't take my word for it, but my understanding is that if they do adapt your story into a movie or TV show, they'll give you, a few $1,000 anyway. Even if they're not cutting you in for an actual percentage.
Yeah,
So
and
why would the creators not do that?
yeah, and I hear it's like a point of contention. Like Ed Brubaker is very like upset that he didn't get any money from the movie The Winter Soldier. And I think the person who made Hulk and Wolverine, Len Wein, he says he's made more money from royalties from
Len
Lucius
Wein,
Fox.
Len Wein, who's
Oh,
passed,
Len Wein.
and he
Uh,
passed away a few years ago.
oh, I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
didn't know. I'm sorry.
Okay.
He,
Yeah.
he said like he made more money from Lucius Fox appearing in the Nolan movies.
Well,
And I
here's the problem, right? Um, Historically, comics for most people are a dead end financially. Um, Eventually, you age out of it, or you feel like you've been abused. Because because if you see some character you made up and they're making a movie out of it, and they give you 10 grand, but the movie is made 100 million, or half a billion, you feel, well, the 10 grand is nice, but it's like 1/100th of 1% of whatever. So wait, so how did I get on that rant? What did you asked me?
oh about like movie royalties and comic
Yeah,
writers feeling like
I mean, so that's why what a lot of people do is they build a reputation at Marvel or DC, and then they go off and do creator owned stuff because owning 100% of you know owning 100% of something that makes a relatively small amount of money is still better than owning no percent of Spider-Man or no. I mean, look, it's fun to write Spider-Man, fun to draw. All these characters are fun to work on, but at the end of the day, they are owned by a big corporation. So, and now maybe if you're James Cameron or Frank Miller or somebody in that tippy top 1%, you can negotiate a deal that says that this gets made into a movie, even though it's not my character. People in that tippy top maybe can negotiate special deals, but overall, it's work for hire. You don't own it. Um, if an editor comes along and overrules you, or an artist draws something in a way you don't like it, or a writer scripts something in a way the artist doesn't like it, there's no, your only recourse is just to leave. You know, the only thing you have. Um, so at one point in the company's history in the 90s, there were contracts for new characters that would set aside a certain percentage of licensed money for the creators of the character. But that, but the most popular characters are the ones that were created 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. And I think the most notable is the Kirby family did make a deal with Marvel, and they got reportedly 100 something, 140 million. I don't, it's never been actually revealed, but A, Jack was long gone, and B, they did have to like spend years in litigation. Um, Ideally, every time you wrote a comic or drew a comic, there'd be some clause in the contract that says, you know, if we do X with this, you get Y amount. But it's unlikely, again, because it's not just collaborative on one story. It's not a shared universe. It's collaborative across decades. Um, so yeah, yeah, that is you know that is why a lot of people will build a reputation um, in mainstream comics, superhero comics, then go off and do their own thing. Because eventually, I don't know of any case where it's not true. You know, um, well, I take that back. But in many cases, there comes a point where you have a showdown with a company, and it becomes very clear that you don't own that character, you know. And then, it's yeah, it's I yeah, I totally get why people would be angry, and it is funny. I mean, there's no hard and fast rule. There's no formula, so that it is probably, what Len said, he made more money from Lucius Fox than from Wolverine or something. Is that what he said?
Yeah, I think so. Like because the movie adaptations.
Yeah, but I mean, but it's totally. I mean, maybe within the company, there's somebody in accounting who has a formula, or maybe it depends on how much clout a creator has. But I mean, but there is no, yeah, it goes back to the origins of comics, which are that, goes back to the way Siegel and Schuster were treated when they created Superman.
Oh yeah.
Which, again, there were years when they were paid well, but nowhere near as well as somebody who created the most popular superhero of all time should have been paid.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that like in Marvel movies at least, a lot of the new prominent characters, they're like phasing out the old generation, and a lot of them are ones that have been created in the last 20 years. And I know DC, they haven't touched Superman in like a few years in movies. Like they're really like for the most popular characters of all time, it's really interesting that it's like just stagnating and like Marvel's moving on. DC just doesn't have a plan for that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but anything I'd say about that would just be guesswork. I have no
That's
idea.
fair.
I have absolutely, also, I think we're also talking in comparative terms. I mean, I guess there's a certain level on which a movie that only makes $300 million is considered a failure, but it made $300 million. I mean, so these are all relative terms that have to do with publicly held companies that have to answer to their shareholders, and so success and failure are very, it's they have different meanings in those contexts.
Okay, that's fair. My next question. So you've written considerably for Darkhawk. I'm still getting through the series. It's
I
very
wrote
good.
it. I wrote every issue of Darkhawk.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying it. My first exposure was in Avengers Arena, in which he dies pretty early on. So it was
Yeah.
nice to go
Well,
back and finally understand.
is that some kind of alternate universe?
Um, no, it was mainlined that it turns out he was alive and like he didn't actually die, but for a majority of the series, he was
Yeah,
quote unquote dead.
when they stopped paying me, I stopped paying close attention.
It was a cool premise. They like brought a lot of characters who weren't in like the limelight,
Yeah,
and they,
I know.
yeah, it was very brutal just to see him like all these children forced to kill each other. But
Oh, is
yeah,
that
he
what the
used the
premise was?
linchpin of the series. It was cool.
Yeah.
Um, what do you have any? I'm sure you, or I don't know if you have like an actor in mind. I hear a lot of comic writers they like visualize an actor when they write or artists. Is there an actor in mind that you've envisioned as playing a Darkhawk?
No. I that, that nobody's ever asked me that question. I think, although I'm associated with the character, I didn't create it. It was created by Tom DeFalco and Mike Manley. Um, I guess because he was Spider-Man for the '90s, right? I thought of him as a little more self-assured Peter Parker. Although if you read the early comics, Peter Parker became pretty self-assured pretty early on. But the cliche of Peter Parker is that he's self-doubting and indecisive. That's a really good question, and you know what? I mean, I would say that I modeled Darkhawk on me. I mean, maybe that's why I didn't have a particular actor in mind. Because I just tried to imagine, I tried to remember myself. There were two things I tried to remember when writing almost any superhero comic. What would me at that age have done? And what would 12-year-old me have responded to if I was reading it in a comic?
That's interesting.
So that's a really good question, but sort of Mike, that might be a better question for Manley, who actually drew it. I mean, I'd be, I'd be curious who he had in mind.
And what's really interesting, I asked JM like who inspired Blue Beetle, and he said he put a lot of himself into Blue Beetle. So I didn't realize how common that was. I think that's really interesting.
Well, if you're right, I mean, it's unlikely. I don't know if you have enough affinity for a character that an editor thinks you're the right person to write it or draw it, and then you further have that affinity where you go, yeah, that would be really cool. I think a lot of it, you know, right, the superhero fantasy, right? Like I've never written Conan the Barbarian,
Love
and
Conan.
with all due respect, with all due respect to the very talented people who've written and created it, I couldn't give a shit about Conan the Barbarian. I have absolutely no resonance with that character. I can read it and I can admire it and understand the talent and the craft and the skill and the inspiration. But at the end of the day, I don't care about anything about Conan the Barbarian. um, so if you're ideally, I mean, ultimately as a someone who does something as a freelancer, ultimately you are going to write something you don't feel. I mean, I wrote The Dazzler for several years. Um, and I think the same thing. I mean, although there would I treated her as if she was a hybrid of me and Peter Parker. I mean that really, um, and I think that's how I treated Darkhawk. Right, with JM, the trick is um, to then find a way to relate to multiple characters. You know, um, because they're all part of the writers and artists. So somebody was asking me today. I was being interviewed today, and I was asked, did I think, say the Thing, or talking about the Fantastic Four. I think the Thing or Mister Fantastic were more Stan or Jack, and I said they were like this strange combination of the two of them, which didn't mean they liked each other necessarily, because I don't think they always did. And obviously Kirby had a lot of issues, and those are complicated relationships, but something about the alchemy of them working together made those characters reflect both of their personalities. Mr. Fantastic, Reed Richards, would be kind of the sophisticated vision that Stan and Jack had of themselves, and Ben Grimm would be more like the stand-up comedian version, which they each had, I think. So it was. So yes, I think the idea is whatever character you're writing, you have to um, inhabit that character and find something in them to relate to.
It's interesting. I guess that's also why like a lot of writers like feel demoralized when they like lose the character or something because they put so much in it. That's interesting.
Yeah, and then
Wow.
and 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 like I said, with rare exceptions, unless you own the character yourself, you will one day find your interests creatively and otherwise at odds with the specific editor and the overall corporate vision. So yeah, it makes
Okay.
um which is not which is not to say you can't go back and revisit. Certainly JM goes back and revisits Spider-Man and is one of the all-time top Spider-Man writers. It's um but yeah, that so Darkhawk. um there's a I can't speak for everybody, but it's and I counted this as an editor too, so I can't say I'm not I can't say I'm innocent of this, but you know there's a part of me that sees a new Darkhawk story and I go, yeah, did you lose my phone number? you know but by the same token, I have done that to other people. I've written or edited characters that I know the original creators would have wanted to be involved with, but that was not uh, the direction that I or the company wanted to go. So you know, works both ways.
Okay. Actually, I asked this question to JM too. I asked because I know he didn't create the JLI, but I asked if DC contacted him to make a live action treatment for it, would he do it? Would you be interested in doing that for like any characters if Marvel approached you?
Um, it would depend on the money, really. I mean, that especially right, the comic books I have a emotional attachment to. Right, I was reading comics from the time I was 5 years old. I was reading Marvel comics from Fantastic Four from Fantastic Four 2, Amazing Spider-Man 1. Um, if you read my books, you can I think it comes through. I have an attachment to those characters. So if some but the movies, again, taking nothing away from the people involved with them, but to me the movies are just product. They're it's nice to see them. It's interesting to see the characters expanded, especially because movies talk about a collaborative medium. They go through so many hands. I the closest a lot of stories I edited have shown up adapted into problem is usually they only adapt bits and pieces of stories, or they combine stories, or they modify them. The closest that I remember having this really kind of almost a chill running through me was in the first Fantastic Four movie. There's a scene in it where Ben Grimm, it's like it's right after they get their powers, they come back home, and Ben Grimm has a meeting with this woman he's been dating, and of course he's now the Thing. So there's a scene, a very emotional scene with them, and it takes place on a bridge. I think he's been thinking of jumping off it because he's so upset over having become the Thing. And I wrote a story. It was like a backup in Marvel Fanfare called "The Day After," or I think "The Day After." That was exactly about that. It was about what, because oddly enough, that had never, maybe now it's been, but at that point, nobody had ever done a story about literally the day after they got their powers. And I had a scene with Ben, with a woman he'd been dating, and them having a confrontation on a bridge. And that scene, a similar scene, was in the movie. And again, I did it work for hire. There was no obligation. And I sent a bunch of emails to people, maybe even including the screenwriter. I don't know if I got whatever. I sent a lot of emails just to say, I said, look, I'm not looking for money. That was a lie, but I'm not looking for money. But I would just be curious. Was somebody aware of that story, or was it just a case of great minds thinking alike? And I could never get a straight answer.
Yeah, you're like once they agree with you, then they think they're on the hook. That's interesting though. That is interesting.
And as I say, a lot. In terms of things I edited, a lot of Spider-Man especially ended up in the movies. And again, that's not just scenes as opposed to stories or lines of maybe lines of I don't know about lines of dialogue, but there's things that would be familiar, and that makes sense. It's Spider-Man, but this was like really a story that I wrote as a backup in Marvel Fanfare, which was, not one of the bigger sellers.
Next question is, what inspired you? Sorry, that segue. That is interesting. I'm sorry. I didn't want to take up too much of your time. What inspired you to write Stan Lee's biography?
I hate to sound like a broken record, but it was money. I mean, I grew up admiring Stan Lee. I worked with Stan, and I I found, especially his life, is also a history of the comic book industry, and a history of a lot of things in popular culture, and a story about a specifically Jewish American comic book creator who came, from a similar background to my uh, parents, aunts, and uncles. I work. One of the things I do is I run something called Will Eisner Week. If you know who Will Eisner was,
Oh yeah.
so I run an annual thing, which you should do with your comic book club every March around Eisner's birthday, called Will Eisner Week. Look it up, and it's people having, just like you, clubs like yours having events relating to Will Eisner, and it's every March because Will's birthday was March 6th. Um, and so that was, a lot of my interest in the history of comics has to do with that. It feels very familiar and yet different to me, right? I mean, obviously, people who go into comics made different life choices and had different life experiences, but ultimately come from similar worlds that me and my own family came from. So if I wanted to write a book about that, the only person of mainstream comics that you could write a book about that would be picked up by a major publisher and would have a hope of selling to a wide audience would be Stan Lee. Again, not to take anything away from the geniuses he worked with and all the great talents that have been in the comic industry, but the only person you could get um, a book on the what's hot now table at Barnes and Noble, Stan Lee. So that's that's one of the reasons. I also knew Stan. I knew Stan, but not well. Right. I worked with him a long time. I worked with him actually more after I left Marvel, I think, than when I was at Marvel, because I was always the guy who knew Stan, wherever else I went. Um, but I could relate to him. I knew a lot about him. I was on friendly terms with him, but I felt that I wasn't so close to him that you know, that if unpleasant stuff or unflattering stuff about him came up, I felt like I would be able to relate it. Not everybody agrees. Some people, most people I think it's a pretty fair view of Stan. I know some people think that I was too easy on him. Let them, when they write their book, they can tell the truth as they see it. But that, and it was really a challenge actually, because Stan is, right. Most people, 99.9% of the world, well, Stan is that adorable old man in the Marvel movies and TV shows. We don't know really what he did, but he's adorable. Um, but obviously, for comics fans, there's this endless controversy about who did what and who got paid, and rewarded, and who was treated fairly and who was not, and so it's impossible. The only, well, not the only. I I have not blocked many people on social media, um, but I'd say 9/10 of the people I have blocked were people who, didn't just have a different opinion or didn't just have a strong opinion, but were really fucking nasty and abusive. And I just figured life is too short.
Oh yeah, that's the right way to do it.
But I mean, I'm right now writing a book about a guy named Jack Ruby, who was the guy who killed Lee Harvey
Oh
Oswald, and
yeah.
who was another like eccentric Jewish guy.
I didn't know he was Jewish. Wow.
Well, there you go. Now you have to buy my book when it comes out, which will be out next year in time for the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, that's great.
So
Now I
Ruby,
have to buy it.
so Ruby, so I only say this half seriously, but there's a million books and documentaries about the Kennedy assassination and a million different opinions about what really happened. And in that way, weirdly enough, it's not unlike the debates about who did what at Marvel 60 years ago. I mean, so that's weirdly enough the kind of intensity that people would approach the who did what on Spider-Man argument as who really killed JFK. So it should be an interesting ride when this book comes out to you know so I just I don't want to. I'm not trying to trivialize the Kennedy assassination, but it's become such a myth. Everything, or even if somebody came out and said, "Here's proof. Here's exactly what happened," nobody would believe them. I think it's the same thing. Here's videotape of Stan and Jack talking about Fantastic Four. We don't believe you.
That's interesting. And I think you're definitely right about like Stan Lee having this image and like people not fully understanding. Like my mother, I went to like the Miami Book Fair and Mark Evanier was speaking and he was speaking about Jack Kirby. And my mother had no idea who he was, and she was like fascinated. And then like he mentioned that Jack Kirby had died. And she's like, "When did he die? I had no idea." And like it's interesting that like people don't even realize.
So, what was the fascinating part? I'm interested. What fascinated? I mean, Mark is a terrific speaker and very smart, but what particularly?
Like she didn't realize he had like this impact and that he helped create or he co-created so many characters with Stan Lee. She was under the impression it was like all Stan Lee.
It's interesting. So, yeah. Well, Mark is. I mean, he put out a coffee table book about Jack, but he's been working on a full scale biography for years. That I don't know when it's coming out, but that's
It's funny, like
that.
I was like 6 years ago and he mentioned he was like working on it, and I thought it was out by now.
Like I said, there's a book. Um, I think that Abrams put out that's more of a coffee. It's biographical, but it's more of a coffee table art book. But yeah, I think he's been working forever on this. He was very close with Jack, and he was close with Stan too, but not in the same way.
Yeah. Oh, and he also said that like he was very like he saw like a few movies with Stan and he was very unhappy with like how they credited him in the credits. Like they just said like special thanks to Stanley and Jack Kirby. They don't say specifically what they did. And he said that like frustrated them.
Uh, yeah, they've corrected that a little. I mean, now you will. I mean, say you go to see Thor, and it'll say Thor created by Stan Lee, Larry Lieber, and Jack Kirby. So it changes all the time. Um, I imagine it has more to do with like lawyers' opinions than any actual cosmic sense of fairness. Yeah, it's now mostly they say from based on the Marvel comics. Again, because it's in the interest of these big companies to make the characters more important and more recognizable than any one or two creators.
Okay. That's what's it brings me to my next question. What surprised you the most about writing Stan Lee's biography? Like, did you not know about certain details that just caught you off guard?
You know, the name Martin Goodman. Martin Goodman was the founder of Marvel. He founded the Timely pulp magazine company, and out of that spun off Marvel Comics, which was called Timely Comics in the 30s and 40s, and then Atlas Comics. It wasn't off and on. It was called Marvel, but it wasn't fully the name till the 60s. So Martin Goodman was Stan's boss, as well as his cousin, as well as his cousin-in-law. So that obviously everybody that was well known. Um, and if you read the book, you'll see it's a real all the story of all the major comic book companies, Archie and the DC and Marvel and Harvey, they're all family dynasty sagas. And so I think I knew Stan always phrased it that he used to just say it was just a coincidence that he happened to go to look for a job at the company that happened to be owned by his cousin. Then he modified it to be something like another relative of his suggested that Simon and Kirby, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who were the first editor and art director, needed an assistant, and he happened to run into Martin in the hallway, and Martin didn't even know. That all seems to be baloney, that. So but I had not quite realized. So technically, if Martin is owning the company, even if Stan is a high placed executive, ultimately Martin has to approve anything Stan. And even that, I don't think I realized how involved both professionally and personally Stan and Martin were, and their families. I think that was the biggest revelation to me. Yeah, because it affects, it's it was a complicated relationship because it's not like Stan was not Martin's son. Stan was, I think, doubly in some weird way related to Martin, but doubly in distant ways. He was um, Martin was Stan's mother's cousin's brother-in-law.
Oh wow. It's like Spaceballs. Like
Yeah, I'm not sure why Spaceballs have. Oh, right,
like I'm your father's
right,
nephew's
right, right,
son's
right,
former
right.
roommate.
Nice to have a Spaceballs reference. Um, so it's not like Stan was Martin's son. Martin had three children, and one of whom wanted to take over the business, but Stan kind of blocked that. We read about it in the book, or you can look it up on Wikipedia, whatever you want. But so it's not like he was the guy's son, but he also wasn't a stranger, right? It was this, and in some ways, Martin almost treated him like a son, except when he didn't. You know, so it was a much more complicated relationship than I realized. So I think that's probably I think Martin Goodman intentionally kept himself out of the limelight. He wasn't interested in being a celebrity, except he did have some like movie star gossip magazines, and then he would occasionally put himself in it. Like you'd see, Martin with some '60s starlet or movie star, um, in the middle of an article, and but he didn't have that affection for the limelight that Stan had, But that I would say that was the biggest surprise to me.
That's interesting. I've heard about like Stan joining Marvel, and this is like the first time I've ever heard it was like through family. I didn't realize it was like a family dynasty, like you said. That changes a lot of things. That's interesting.
I again look at the history of all the major companies; they are all family stories.
Wow. So like the two books in my Amazon cart right now are your Superman on the Couch and the Stan Lee Biography. So I'll buy those soon. But the final question.
If you find Disguised as Clark Kent, I think you might be interested. I mean, you can find it. You probably find a beat up used copy.
I
But
mean,
that's the
eBay has everything nowadays.
Oh, you
Oh,
can buy. Oh, I'm not saying you can't find it. I'm saying to find it at a reasonable price. That's
oh, is it like? Oh,
Yeah. It had a weird situation when it came out. Superman on the Couch went through like 4 or 5 printings. People come up to me all the time and say, "Oh, I used that book to research my master's thesis."
oh wow.
Guys, as Clark Kent, I think it's a better book. It's the one that drills down into the Jewish origins. But when it came out, there was like an upheaval at the publishing company, so there was nobody really advocating for it. So
But you said it's an audiobook too?
yeah, both of
Oh,
those, all three of those books are audiobooks. The
okay. Whichever I can't find in print, I'll get audio.
Yeah, and the audiobooks, literally, I just did them this past year.
Oh, I have to drive home 7 hours on like Sunday, so it's perfect timing. Um,
Okay.
so the final question is like from me and like a lot of other people in the club are aspiring writers. I asked JM the same question, and like it's interesting people's different answers. Nowadays, I imagine the industry has completely shifted. How would you personally recommend people get involved in the industry, whether it's as a writer, artist, or editor?
It's well. Let me go back to that thing, that anecdote I told like an hour ago. And because it relates to the Stan thing. You may not think you know anybody at the companies, but maybe you do. Especially now in the age of social media. You might well have a cousin who has a friend who has an ex-wife who somehow is connected. So don't be afraid to at least use them to try to get a door open for you. Don't think, oh, I don't know anybody. You probably know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. um However, comics have always been the most democratic medium in this, next to maybe fiction, next to prose, because if all you want is to tell a story, then all you need is a piece of paper and a pencil, and a photocopy machine. And now all you need is you don't even need that. You need a web, some way to access getting onto the web. I'm not saying you'll get rich that way, but what you know what people, and not everybody's goal is to work for Marvel or DC, but we now have this incredible thing, the World Wide Web, where you can write and draw something now, and 5 minutes later, it's available to the entire world. Your challenge is, how do you promote it and get the word out about it and get people excited about it? If your goal is ultimately to work for either Marvel, DC, or one of the graphic novel companies or a manga company, then your best bet is probably publishing something that's good. I mean, and get it and it doesn't have to be a big bestseller. Um, and somehow get it in front of somebody who's a decision maker, and then either maybe they'll want to publish your thing or hire you to publish something else or hire you to work for them. um, I think what I did, which was to sort of come in off the street and happen to hit it off with Larry Lieber, who then hired me to be his assistant. I don't know, that's not impossible. And then also, especially, actually, you guys, if you're in school, all the publishing companies have intern programs.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely planning on applying this
Yeah, yeah.
semester.
So I mean, those are the different ways, but just don't forget, it's still the entertainment business. Lots of people want to do it. Lots of talented, driven people want to do it. Lots of talented, driven people willing to work for free want to do it. So that it's um, go to comic conventions. Um, don't act don't don't act entitled, and don't act like you're stalking. But I mean, the interesting thing about comics is that you can meet most of your comic book heroes, and you can meet most of, including editors and publishers, just by showing up at a convention or at a talk. And now, in the world of Zoom, I mean, I've met a lot of people I would never have met just attending Zoom events or having them attend my Zoom events. So don't, but once you meet them, have something to back it up, and be honest with yourself. You know, if you're looking to do an indie comic, and your personal vision is the most important thing, then that's one thing. If you're looking to draw Spider-Man, be honest with yourself. Is your art as good as what they're publishing? Because if it's not, they don't need you, and you may think whoever publishing sucks, but that's your problem, not theirs.
Yeah, that's like what JM said was like if you're a writer, like you can't just hand them a script. You have to have like a comic like drawn out. And like for artists it's easier. So I like it. It's interesting. It's like two sides of the same coin, your advice. I like it.
and
Definitely
I
gonna try to use both.
and I think the other thing is, don't just write comics. Be a writer who writes all sorts of stuff. Write a biography, write a novel, write a TV pilot. Don't just, because again, no matter how hot you are and how well liked you are and how talented you are, one day something will happen beyond your control that'll make it impossible for you to continue on whatever path you're on, and you need to have other paths.
That's interesting. Okay, I like that advice. That's awesome. Okay, so like the diversify, like don't just put all your eggs in one basket and like really
Yeah.
just push yourself. Okay, that's really
And
interesting.
and these places do, there aren't a lot of staff jobs, but they do have staff jobs, and so maybe edit a magazine, maybe edit an independent comic. Do you want to be able to, you want to be able to say either, literally here's something, or here's, well, probably better to have a physical something, because once you start saying to a busy person, come visit my website, then the odds are not good that they're going to follow through because they just don't have time, and they don't want to click on a link and download a virus onto their onto their computer.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll print out whatever I bring to a con. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm
Oh,
sorry
thank
for
you.
the lack of turnout. But the
Yeah.
recording is definitely going to be a hit. It's just finals week. I didn't realize today was finals when I booked this.
Well, it was nice talking to you, but yeah, tell your mom that you talked to a Ramaz person. She might find
Oh,
that.
she will definitely get a kick out of this. And my uncle, he grew up reading comics too, and he's a New York local. I don't know if the last name Langer means anything.
Not, I
Um,
mean, I heard the name. It doesn't. But tell your mother that if you remember that my father was the cantor in the 30s and 40s at the synagogue connected to Ramaz, a place called Kehillat Jeshurun. She might find that amusing.
what was the place called?
Kehillat Jeshurun. It was the synagogue that was directly, literally and figuratively connected to Ramaz.
Okay, I'll tell her that. I'm gonna call her right
She'll,
after this.
she'll know the name. All right. Well, look, this was fun. Send me a link when wherever you're putting it. Send me a link to it.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And I'm gonna look into Eisner Week. That sounds
Yeah,
fantastic.
Will Eisner Week. Yeah, yeah. Please, yeah, yeah. You definitely, yeah. And if you can't, I mean, you should be able to find it. But if you can't, go to WillEisner.com, because not only do we have events, but we over the COVID years we did a lot of very cool videos, presentations with Todd McFarlane and
Ooh.
a lot of famous artists, both independent and mainstream. So,
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it.
hey, same here.
Have a good day and Chag Sameach for and happy Hanukkah.
All right, if you find yourself in New York, give me a call.
Definitely, definitely.
All right, take care.
Thank you. You too.